Kylie Peppler, thanks for coming in today. It's been so great to have you back here on campus. I started knowing you first through the work we were both doing in the MacArthur-funded Digital Media and Learning Initiative. Tell me a little bit about the work you were doing there.
Yeah, that's right. So that was about 15 years ago. A group of us, and many of us have started to come to this campus now. And we were starting to really understand what digital media meant for the future of learning. At the time, people were scared of video games, scared of the internet, scared of what computers might mean for the educational landscape, and not sure what social media was even going to mean. And so a group of us were really starting to study sort of this turn to digital media and how the 21st century was going to really change what it meant for learning and teaching today. My work in there, I started looking at the maker movement, or looking at how people make things, cooking or sewing, or doing robotics.
3D printing?
3D printing, laser cutting, all of these kind of things, and sort of this turn, and sort of trying to understand what that meant as kind of a renaissance for education, a kind of a return to sort of maker culture within schools. What was kind of went by the wayside with home ec leaving and tech shop classes leaving, and so what does this all mean as we start to bring this back into it? And this happens to be a really great opportunity for hands-on learning, for the types of constructionist learning that I was really interested in. So that's kind of how we all started.
Right, and your work really focused on this kind of production aspect.
Yeah.
Also, why is that so central to how you think about education?
Yeah, well, and connected learning, which was kind of the theory that emerged from the work that we were all doing together, really posits, as well as constructionist learning theory, that the production that we're creating is an externalization of our minds, of what we know. And so as we create something, we start to show what it is that we understand, and then we can reflect on it. So if we start a painting, oftentimes we're like, oh, well, that's not quite what I had in my head, and we keep iterating on that. And then as I share that painting with you, you might say, oh, that surprises me, or I see something else in it, and it starts a conversation. So without externalizing and having those productions, we can't have that same type of reflection or that same type of conversation.
And you came to UCI. You had been here once before with the UC Presidential Postdoc Fellowship.
That's right.
Tell us about that, a little bit about that early experience, and then what it was like to come back just last year.
That's right. Yeah, so this is really a homecoming, which is really fun for me. So I was here, about a decade ago, doing my postdoctoral work with Dr. Mark Warschauer and Leanne Briette, and really starting to understand what children with disabilities could do with digital media production. And at the time, we were studying the Scratch platform, because I was involved in the original design and study of the Scratch platform.
The early years of something that
That's
really
right.
took off and as a national, international.
It is
impact.
200 million users now. Yeah. There's a new Scratch project posted like every 30 seconds or something around the clock now. And so at the time, we just started discovering, that kind of led to my postdoctoral work, is that the kids actually that were the most profound users of Scratch could hardly read and write. They were very young readers, and even doing some of their letter identification. So Mark and I sort of embarked to sort of understand what it is that they were creating, how that was leading to sort of their overall literacy development. And at the same time, we also found that some of the work that they were creating was the most profound artistically. So how could these young children that could, barely read and write become some of our most sophisticated computer programmers? And so that was kind of the area that we were studying in that work.
And your current appointment here at UCI is one of these bridging appointments, a unique appointment. I personally think it's the best way to be set up as a faculty. I had a similar arrangement prior to being dean between the School of Education and the informatics unit in informatics and computer science. Tell us about how you bridge those two worlds and kind of where your work comes together.
Yeah. So as a learning scientist, I love to study how people learn in everyday context. And throughout that, I kind of specialize in how the arts and new technologies start to combine in ways that start to change the nature and what we know about learning. So this is kind of a unique opportunity that I'm just now starting to explore by kind of having the joint appointment in both schools. So now, the lab can have expertise through the students that are coming to the lab, both in sort of education, sort of theories of learning, different ways of studying, the methodologies of how do we document that learning. There's all sorts of new opportunities now, as well as the design of those new technologies. And so on the informatics side, we can understand how to make those technologies, how to refine existing technologies to be in line with our theorizing. And so it's kind of a unique opportunity to kind of toggle between those two worlds. And it allows me to teach classes at that intersection around the graduate and undergraduate level, around ubiquitous computing or maker culture, or anything that would be at that intersection of learning theory and design.
I know you're spending a lot of time in this lab, the Connected Learning Lab that sits in the middle.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that space and kind of the people that are inhabiting it, and because it connects back to our earlier work.
It does,
as well.
yeah. So the Connected Learning Lab, with colleagues like Mimi Ito and Constance Steinkuhler, Kurt Squire, yourself, and many of us, many others. There's 37 faculty actually across campus. We've actually started to consolidate sort of the world's experts on sort of connected learning and understanding what that means. And so there's opportunities to do all sorts of interdisciplinary research. The physical space is starting to emerge. How can we start to design some of those prototypes and study them? There's a group that's working on games, on health and informatics, the work that we're doing on e-Textiles and sort of maker culture. That whole group is starting to emerge, and so it's been really fun. So we theorize and we design and build. We're doing all sorts of different data collection at museum sites and places here in Orange County, but also across the globe.
So let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on some of your current work. I know you're spending a lot of time thinking about materials themselves and the affordances of the materials.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, well, we've started looking at, a lot of times we're at school and we have all of these hands-on materials, and generally most of the time we kind of think, toys for kids, that those are a good idea, that when you play Chutes and Ladders, for example, you have good number sense as a child, or if you play with blocks, you have a good understanding of geometry, of early physics learning. Playing with toy cars can be a similar kind of thing, is that early physics learning is really tied to having played with, cars on ramps and so forth.
And this goes all the way back to kind of Piaget and kind of the original appreciation for how games were kind of central to how kids figured out the world.
Yeah, and so we've always known that our physical materials are kind of tied to those learning outcomes. Whether it's Maria Montessori or Friedrich Froebel or Piaget's kind of notion. And we've struggled a little bit about even in the early history of books, were those good for learning? So we've always had these sort of debates, but we haven't really started to understand sort of the cultural context of those materials and how those materials are not neutral. And so the tools, materials that we choose to put into a classroom, they culturally reflect who made them, who's used them in the past. And so as a learner comes into that space and sees them put on the table, they make some immediate judgments on whether that material's for them. And then as they engage with the materials, we have to realize too that there's really large implications for whether you can learn with those materials or not. Some of those materials are actually just not well designed for learning. And so it's important that we as researchers actually start to help the field to create those kinds of tools and materials. We don't want tools that actually don't contribute to learning to get out into schools. We don't want people making a profit on those kinds of tools and materials. And frankly, when we start looking at these things, actually we find a lot of the ones that are the best sellers to schools actually don't actually lead to any learning gains. But some of the other newcomers to the landscape kind of coming in through the maker movement, like squishy circuits or e-Textiles, are starting to get us to actually find ways that we can actually teach that conceptually, very rigorously, so in the classroom. So we're excited about that.
And you mentioned e-Textiles. I've always been really taken by that
Yeah.
work. So what are e-Textiles?
It is beautiful work. So e-Textiles, I embarked with my colleague Leah Buckley, and so she was the designer of the Lily Pad Arduino. So it's a small computer that can be sewn into clothing, and it can actually start to control things like so we designed some early puppets, for example, with e-Textiles, or a dancer that could be wearing a costume that could then actually control the music and the composition of the music. But this could be an electronic harp. This could also be a lunchbox that keeps track of the temperature, so that you know that the food is actually stored at a safe temperature within there. Lots and lots of different applications. It's sort of the softer side of robotics.
Yeah, and often you're drawn to kind of things that can be programmed and have allow for creativity,
right?
Rather than kits that are fixed. Right?
Yeah, my dissertation was called Creative Code, and when I fell in love with programming, I was always an artist, but when I fell in love with programming, it was when the kids started telling me it was a material that they could make anything they wanted with. It was like paper, and I mean, isn't that so cool? Isn't that how we want all kids to kind of understand most of these STEM learning? Is we don't want them to think about it as a set of narrow facts to memorize or an equation, but really as things that can be shaped and molded. And so kind of, I've sort of looked at different ways that we can do computation, through paper programming or through e-Textiles or through, Play-Doh and sort of squishing circuits. And so different ways that we can materialize that learning. And then what's the advantage of using all those different materials? They're new, but are they better for learning? And so that's been really the core of a lot of the latest research is we shouldn't just adopt them because they're new and they're interesting, or because girls might like them, but they really should substantially change the learning experience.
And equity, I know, is central to your work.
Yeah.
Why is this so critical to thinking about kind of STEM education and some of the inequities we see in participation patterns?
Yeah, well, we get sort of stuck, especially in the same old problems. And a lot of times, we try, I always kind of think about with STEM education, a lot of times we try to fix the teaching, or we try to fix the way in which we're teaching it. And so, I always think about it as this car that we're driving, and, it's veering off, to the left, and we have to kind of overcompensate to get it to go right. So we could do robotics, we could do Lego robotics if we do sort of the best teaching, and we have the kids producing like an art exhibit, and we have them walking around, and it's not a competition, and we find that those are really good practices for fostering sort of equitable participation. But what we found is actually beneath all of that is that it's much easier to sort of teach if you start to question the tools and materials. So a lot of the materials I just mentioned, when I put them on a table in an out-of-school program, the kids I most want to reach with those materials, if they can choose to leave, they will. They'll walk out the door and say, well, this isn't for us, and so they'll opt out immediately. So, when we're in a school and we don't have kids that can walk out, we don't know that. And so how do we start to think about what those tools and materials do? How do we get the car to drive straight? Or if it's leaning a little bit towards the left, what should we be doing to compensate for it? Or maybe that's good in some ways. So as designers, we just need to know more about these materials and what their impact is on learning and participation.
And many of these things, of course, can happen in the classroom.
Yeah.
But I know you take seriously some of the cultural organizations
right.
outside of formal schooling
that
you see as critical for this work. Tell me about some of your work with museums and other cultural organizations.
Yeah, so much of what we do in lifelong learning is outside of the classroom, and so we really value and try to design for sort of the everyday. And when you get that right, Scratch, for example, was designed for the out-of-school environment. When you get that right, the kids are asking to sort of pull it into the day, and the adults try to keep up with the pace of what the kids really want in the out-of-school setting. So we try to kind of have that directional impact. So we definitely don't want to dismiss schools or the place of those, but museums. We work with many museums across the U.S., some museums here in Orange County. We're starting to work with the Bowers Museum, for example, and other spaces. We also work with the Computer Clubhouse Network, who's also has some Computer Clubhouse locations right here. You can see how this is just sort of a hotbed. Almost everything you're looking for is like a 15-minute drive. And so these spaces are really set set up to encourage lifelong learning, to experiment with the ways in which we engage in those concepts. So sometimes we're engaging people in data visualization literacy or in engineering and these kinds of spaces. How do we get them to stay with an exhibit longer? And we know we have a good design when somebody stays for 2.5 hours, when an average time you spend with a science exhibit is going to be about less than a minute, or an art piece you'll spend about 30 seconds with. So, as learning designers, we can look for how do we promote longer engagement, things that get sticky that you can't stop thinking about, or that you want to return to the museum time and time again to keep learning. And then those kinds of design principles are what we really want to think about pulling into schools.
Yeah, and I know in some of your design work, you've mentioned kind of the emotional draw of the exhibit, and you gave the example of the dog and the collar.
Oh, yes.
That's
a great story. Well, we're working with the New York Hall of Science, and they've got a great design team there. And they were tinkering around with about 6 different exhibits to do to engage in engineering learning. And we were playing around with this idea about narrative and empathy as being really important to engineering. And what we started to find was that empathy played a really big role. And one of the exhibits was this exhibit that was designed to have you kind of build a Rube Goldberg machine, so something that would kind of have different parts. But you were supposed to help this dog.
And let's for the audience, let's unpack a little bit. What's a Rube Goldberg machine?
Well, OK Go has a great video. So it's sort of that classic mousetrap, of the ball that drops, it then sets something else in motion, and so you have kind of a beginning, middle, and end, to that experience, and they can get really elaborate. And so, those OK Go videos are amazing.
And a very complicated way to get from A to B through this incredible mechanical contraption.
It is. So you can imagine that's great for engineering.
Interestingly enough, many people talk about it, social welfare policies in the U.S. as having the same Rube Goldberg-like character to them.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah. So this one, they were playing around with this idea of trying to help this dog character. And we had kind of a narrative and a non-narrative setting. And in the non-narrative, there was just no dog that we were trying to help. And in the narrative setting, there was a dog that we were trying to either feed, or you were trying to entertain the dog, some sort of social purpose. And it became really funny. It was almost an accident that one of the dogs just lost his collar, and all of a sudden the average engagement went from like 90 minutes down to about 20 minutes. And we're like, wait, this collar is really important. So it would say "feed me" or "I'm bored," and so we started seeing how do we design for empathy, but then what's the empathy role in sort of the iterative kind of engineering engagement, and so that's been the focus of that work for the last couple of years.
In all this work with really this cutting edge technology like 3D printing, e-Textiles, and the like, has I think led you to thinking a lot about kind of work and the future of work and skills necessary for it. Tell me about that line of research you're working on.
And as we think about maker culture, or we think about education in general, we oftentimes ask ourselves the so what. And I think at this moment, in time, we're starting to really think about what, so makers and involved in maker education, you might learn about circuitry, you might become, really advanced in your sort of engineering understanding that would be applicable to becoming a future electrician, or to designing, there's wonderful foundations like 2-bit circus, for example, or designing like an escape room. You can imagine all these different ways that you could put sort of that physics and electronics and circuitry understanding to good use. So we have to start to wrestle with that future of work now. And what does that mean for pre-skilling and sort of reskilling? And I know, for most undergraduates, for most graduate students right now, we're really worried about future employment. And so here at the university, we're starting to really study how can we introduce sort of those skills that we can anticipate that are actually going to be really useful in our classes and learn about them. But how can we start to research how we can propel learning even faster? So much of our work takes the big ideas that even adults can't understand. And if we design it the right way, we can bring it down to even second graders, that can actually excel at understanding systems thinking or ideas around complexity or other things about circuitry, things that undergraduates have traditionally wrestled with. And so a lot of our work is working with engineers, working with a lot of these kind of like fab labs or digital fabrication centers, and kind of thinking about how we can start to redesign those tools and materials and connect that to that future workplace. And so we're starting to work more and more with different employers and places of employment as well about how we can start to re-engineer that. That also sometimes takes us into social and emotional learning and social skills. A lot of the things that get left on the side of K-16 education that become really, really important to employers that we need to sort of weave into our course development and all of that.
So it's really a fascinating body of work. Well, Kylie, we're very grateful to get you back to UCI. We're very fortunate to have you back here. Thanks for coming in and sharing today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. It's been really fun.